I'm going to say that we have earned the rights to hear a good story. Seeing as we've been, through this process already for so long. And that's what exactly this Mishnah that we're going to do is a story. The whole Mishnah is a story. This is chapter 6, Mishnah 9. And before we start the story, the question I have to ask you is, why is there a story in the Mishnah? Let's be honest. This is Pirkei Avos. This is the story about ethics. This is the story about how you're supposed to behave. This is the story, this is the section in the Mishnah that talks about values. You probably would have expected to have stories along the way before this. It's quite interesting. We got this far without a story. But then you have to ask yourself, why would there be stories in the Mishnah at all? The purpose of the Mishnah is to teach us what to do. It's not Midrash. In the Midrash, you expect to find many stories. So we have to ask ourselves the question, seeing as we're about to read a story, why a story in the Mishnah? And if you think I'm making a big deal about this, you have to remember that Torah is very precise. And each segment of Torah has a particular objective. And if the objective of a particular area of Torah is to teach us practically what we're supposed to do, and as the Rambam tells us that the nature of the Mishnah is belashon ketzara uberura, to speak very succinctly and clearly, then it seems completely out of place to be doing story time in the middle of the Mishnah. So why do we have a story in the Mishnah? That's the question we have to ask ourselves before we begin this Mishnah. Now, before I get to answer that question about why we have a story in the Mishnah, let's just go back one step and remind ourselves, what did we learn about in the previous Mishnah? Very often, we've seen this before, we'll see it again. It's quite common in the style of the Mishnah that one teaching will follow on from a previous teaching. It's not unusual to have that. So what did we learn about in the previous Mishnah? Let's just try and recall what we spoke about. We spoke about a whole series of brachas that are befitting to tzaddikim, right? And one of the things that we spoke about as a bracha that is suitable for a tzaddik is wealth. That's how we ended off, not that was the last one on the list, but that's how we ended off the previous Mishnah, is that there are all these brachas that are very valuable if a tzaddik is the one who has those brachas. Now you could walk out of that Mishnah saying, aha, so one of the things that I noticed on the list is that it's a good thing for a tzaddik to have wealth. Maybe that implies that the Torah puts a value on wealth in and of itself. That's going to lead us to the story in this Mishnah, which shows the exact opposite, that in fact, a person who's engaged in Torah is not going to be so interested in wealth, as we shall see from this story. Okay, so that just gives us the segue from the previous Mishnah to this Mishnah. But the big question we have to ask ourselves is, what is the value of a story? What do you get out of a story? Okay, why do we tell stories? Have you ever heard this expression? It's an expression that goes, Hamaise hu ha'ikar, which means you can have all the theory in the world, but the main thing is maise, is action. The main thing is actually what you do. However, there's a more liberal translation of that line, hamaise, telling a good maise, telling a good story, that's the ikar, that's the most important thing. And I can even prove it to you. You want to prove how stories, let's see if anybody could work this out. Where in the Torah do we have evidence of the fact that stories are a critical part of how we communicate, of how we teach values, of how the Torah works? Pesach, okay, good, but that's very good. Okay, so Pesach, but there's a specific mitzvah, and the mitzvah is that you have to tell the story. I'm not disagreeing. I think Pesach is a great example. Any other example that you could give to illustrate that stories are really, really important and central and foundational to the Jewish experience? Thank you, exactly. Look at the Torah. The Torah is a book of instructions. Really, as Rashi says in the very first Rashi, the Torah should have begun with the very first instruction, which we just read about this past Shabbos, the very first mitzvah given to the Jewish nation, the mitzvah of the Jewish calendar. This is a book of instructions. Start with the instructions. Instead, what does it do? It starts with stories. The story of creation, the story of Adam and Eve, the story of Cain and Abel, the story of Noah and the flood, the story of the forefathers. Why do you start with all of these stories? So one of the reasons is because that shows you just how powerful stories are. That you can build an entire nation, you can build an entire philosophy, you can build an entire religion on stories. There's another reason as well. Think about this. If somebody says, I have to tell you a very interesting thought, you'll be interested. Okay, I'd like to hear the thought that you have to say. But if a person tells you, I'd like to share an interesting story, they're going to grab your attention in a whole different way. And the reason for that is because stories have by nature, they have the capacity to open us up. They make us more, I don't want to say the word vulnerable, but certainly more exposed. When you're hearing a story, you're more exposed to hear what the message is. So it's a mechanism to take a concept that might otherwise be abstract and deliver it to the community, deliver it to the audience in a very palatable way. So sometimes when we're telling a story, it's not just because we want to illustrate a point, it's because we want this point to be truly absorbed. It's a very important point, and we want people to walk out of here firstly remembering the story, because that's the nature of stories. We tend to remember stories better than we remember abstract information. And as a result of that, we'll come out with this information. We'll come out with these values, with this principle that we're supposed to take. So that's the importance of telling a story. With that introduction, let's have a look at the story that we're going to read today. It is a story about a sage called Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma. He's not one of the big names that you often hear about. You know, we're used to hearing about Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shimon. But we don't necessarily hear about Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma that often. So who is Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma? Let's just do a little bit of a background so we know who we're dealing with. And then we'll start off with his story. Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma is somebody who was considered to be a colleague of Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion. So that puts him later on in the Mishnah period, closer to the end of the Mishnah period. Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion was one of the people who was murdered by the Romans, one of the Asara Harugei Malchus. Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma had a lot to do with the Romans as well. The interesting thing is that Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma was not only respected by Jewish people, he was respected lahavdil by the Romans as well. He was held in quite high regard. And he was also known as a miracle worker. And the Gemara, for example, tells a story that on one occasion, and for us it's such a shocking concept that, God forbid, people might be abducted and taken hostage. I mean, it's obviously a terrible thing. Unfortunately, we forget that it was part of Jewish history for most of Jewish history. So that doesn't in any way excuse it, but it's just important to know how much precedent we have in our history for how we're supposed to relate to hostage situations. In this particular occasion, there were some children who had been abducted by a Roman officer, and he was holding them for ransom. And apparently that wasn't unusual in those days. So Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma went to this Roman officer to negotiate their release, and he offered him an amount for the ransom. And the Roman refused the amount, as is often the case, right? Because halachically, I don't know if you know this, but the halacha is that you're not allowed to offer ransom for hostages that is higher than their actual value, because that will encourage further hostage taking in the future. We're not going to get into that conversation. It's a very bitter conversation, right? So he went and he offered a particular ransom amount, and the Romans said no. So Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma said, okay, fine, turned around and left. No sooner had he left, and this Roman became violently ill. And he literally thought he was going to die. And he was smart enough to realize that it was linked to the fact that he had refused the rabbi. So he sent a messenger, and he called Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma back, and he said, okay, I'm willing to renegotiate. Parenthetically, by the way, this is how you negotiate. You make them feel like they're going to die, and then you negotiate, right? Okay, so that's what happened. So he comes back, and he says to Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma, okay, I'm willing to negotiate. Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma says to him, now that you're willing to negotiate, you're going to release them for nothing. And whatever time they spent in your clutches, that is the payment of their ransom. And this fellow released them without asking for any money. Okay, lots of insight over there about how you're supposed to deal with these issues. But the fact is, and then he recovered. But the fact is that this is Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma, who was known as a great miracle worker. That doesn't have direct bearing on our story, but it does help you just to understand what caliber of an individual we're talking about. Now, what we're going to have to do over here is read the story. The story includes the conversation between an individual and Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma, which includes Rabbi Yossi's response, which is a shira in its own right, his response. He doesn't just reply to a question that was posed to him. He actually gives a whole shira in response. That shira also includes 3 biblical references, which we'll also need to examine. So there's quite a lot to do. What I'd like to suggest is, as we go through the story, try to be as intellectually vigilant as possible to see what about the story jumps out at you, if there's anything about the story that jumps out at you that maybe seems out of place. Okay, because there are elements of the story that seem out of place. Now, I've just described who we're dealing with. This is Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma, one of the greatest sages of the time, a person who's obviously supposed to be a model citizen of how you behave as a Jewish individual. Keep that in mind when you hear the story. Okay? Amar Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma. What are we going to say?
Is his name from what he can do, or it is Ben Kisma?
I don't know that. I'm not sure. Okay? So, Amar Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma, Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma tells the story. He says, Pam achas I was once walking on the road. Okay? I was once walking on the road. Upoga bi adam echad. And a particular man encountered me. Okay? Amar li, the man says to me, Rabbi, meize makom ata. Right? Rebbe, from where do you come from? Meize makom, from what place do you come?
I
don't know, what does it say over there? Oh, sorry, I forgot, you're right, 100%. V'nasan li shalom, sorry, that's a very big part of the story, how could I leave that out? V'nasan li shalom, the man greeted me, v'hechzarti lo shalom, and I responded to him with a greeting as well, shalom. Sorry, that's a very big part of the story, that was part of what I was trying to get your attention to. Does he behave appropriately over here? Okay? So then the man said to me, Rabbi, he said, where are you from? He says, I said to him, I come from a place of great sages and great scribes. So the man says to him, Rabbi, would you like to come? Would you like to come and live with us in our place? And I'll sweeten the deal. And I will give you elef alafim dinarim dimrei zav abadim tovim margolios. I'm going to give you 1,000,000 gold coins and these beautiful precious stones. Just come live with us. Amarti loy. Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma tells the story. He says, I replied to this individual and I said, Beni, my son. Interesting, as you'll see in a moment. Beni, my son, he says, even if you give me all the gold, the silver, and the precious stones in the entire world, I'm only willing to live in a place of Torah. Okay? No deal. And then he starts to give him the shiur. So before we get to that segment, let's just examine the story so far before we get to his full-blown response. So let's just start from the beginning of the story. So the beginning of the story is Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma. Is anything about the story so far that jumps out? I'll tell the story again, just without the Hebrew this time, just to see the flow. Before we get to the shiur, tell me if there's anything that jumps out at you. Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma says, I was once walking on the road, and a man encountered me, and he said, Shalom, and I replied to him, Shalom. And then he said to me, where are you from? And I told him, I come from this place of the great sages. And then he said to me, do you want to come live with us in our place? And I'll give you all this great wealth. And I said to him, if you give me all the wealth in the world, I'm only going to live in a place of Torah. So are there any things about this interaction that strike you as interesting, unusual, out of character, maybe even disappointing? Exactly. Number one, we have already learned earlier in Pirkei Avos, makdim b'shloim kol adam. That the way of Torah is that if you are the person who's dedicated to Torah, then you should always be the person who is first to greet somebody else. In this story, the story is very clear that Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma did not greet the man, and only after the man greeted him, then Hechzarti lo shalom, then I responded to greet him back. Why is Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma not greeting this man? Okay, there's one of the things. Anything else that jumps out at you about the story?
It is the man up. Encountered him.
Correct.
Then encountered the man. Right.
Good. But I want to zone in a little bit more on that. Who's good at Hebrew over here? How would you say, under normal circumstances, I met somebody on the street? Pagashnu. Right? Nifgashnu. Right? What's this paga? What is the meaning of the word pei gimel ayin? What is the root pei gimel ayin? Is to afflict. So in other words, if you really want to translate this directly, it's almost like he's saying, I was walking down the road and this guy assaulted me. That's what it sounds like. Pogga bi adam echad. It's such an unusual expression. Okay, so for two things, right? Why doesn't he greet him? And why is he giving the impression that this man kind of almost like assaulted him on the road? Okay, anything else about the interaction so far?
I mean, why don't you just invite him to come to live at his place?
Why doesn't he invite him to come live with him?
Why did he invite him?
Why did he invite him? Okay, good question.
He's looking at the
Good question.
He's looking what he looks like.
Who is? Who's looking at? Rabbi Yossi is looking at him superficially. The other man is looking at Rabbi Yossi superficially. Okay, so I'd like to develop that thought just a little bit further. What's missing in the story? Picture the scene. So there's this rabbi walking down this, exactly. There's a rabbi walking down the street, an individual comes over to him and says, "Hey, where are you from?" Have you ever started a conversation like that? "Hello, where are you from?" No, you say, "Hello, my name is so-and-so. What is your name? Where are you from?" Right? There's no introduction over here. Isn't that weird? It's like a strange conversation. You just get straight down to business. So I don't know who you are, but you want to come live with us in our town? And I'm going to pay you handsomely for the opportunity. What's going on over here? Okay?
Why should be converting him in a way, and so that this pious man.
Okay, good. So you're suggesting converting him in a negative way?
Yes.
Okay, good. Where do you see that in the story? Let's assume that to be true. Where do you see that in the story?
The very fact that you said, "Come and live with me."
Good. Come and live with us in our place. Good. Hold that thought, because we're going to talk about that as well, right? Come live with us in our place. Now, there are two ways that we can interpret that, as we shall see. Most of the commentaries go the one way, but there is also another possibility about how to interpret that, so we'll get to that in a moment. So he's saying, right, come and live with us in our place. And then what is Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma responding to him? He's saying, "Give me all the money in the world. I'm not leaving my comfort zone." Doesn't sound right. Maybe he should make some inquiries. Maybe this is a town that needs a rabbi. That's what I'm saying, right? Isn't this an opportunity? Here are these people knocking on his door. They're saying, "Please, we need a rabbi." And he says, "Give me all the money in the world. I'm not leaving my yeshiva." Is that the correct attitude? Is that the way that a Jewish person is supposed to behave? Or is it just, totally dismissing him out of hand? He should say, "Let's explore." Maybe he should say, "Okay, I'm not going to do it, but maybe there's somebody else who could do it." It's a very interesting exchange that's going on between the two of them. Okay, but we don't have evidence of that in the Mishnah, so we can't put things into the Mishnah that the Mishnah doesn't tell us. Remember, the Mishnah is very precise in its language, so if it's not telling us that information, then it's not part of the story. Okay, now let's listen to the shir that he gives him. Now he explains thoroughly why he takes this position. He says, the reason is because when a person passes away, you're not taking anything with you. As they say in the classics, a coffin does not have a trailer. Right? So you're not taking any of the wealth with you. Ki'im Torah masim tovim. What are you going to take? Torah and good deeds. Shenema, as the pasuk says, B'salecha tanche oisach. As you walk, it will accompany you. V'shachbecha tishmar alecha. When you lie down, it will guard you. V'akitzoisa hisisichecha. And when you wake up, it will be your conversation. And then he explains. B'salecha tanche oisach b'olam hazeh. When it says that it will accompany you on the way, that means that Torah will accompany you through this life. When it says that it will guard over you when you lie down, that means bakever. When a person passes away, the Torah will protect them. And when it says that when you wake up, it will be your conversation, that is in the world to come.
But he's saying he's not going to give up his place in the world to come.
He didn't say he's not giving up his place in the world to come. He's saying what you're offering me has no value. That's what he's saying. What you're offering me has no value because I can't take it with me. So you can scream and shout about gold and silver. It's not a currency that I'm interested in. In fact, I'll tell you just on that point, in the Sefer Chovos HaLevavos, he tells a parable of this particular country that once a year they had this massive ceremony where they would appoint a king over their population. And the rule was that in order to be the king over their population, you had to be a foreigner. So every year they'd find some foreigner And they tell him, would you like to be the king of our country? And of course, the guy would be very excited and he'd take the position and he'd come. What they didn't tell him was that it's a 1-year position. And what they didn't tell him was at the end of the year, as the pasuk says, "Begapoy avoy, begapoy yitzei." You leave like you came. In other words, you take nothing with you. They didn't tell him this. So what happened? The average guy would take this position, sit on the throne, and immediately start building himself a new palace and buying, fancy clothing, etc., etc. At the end of the year, they'd say, "Shkoyach, thank you very much. Thanks for your input. Please put everything back in the wardrobe and off you go." Eventually, one chacham arrived in this town and he heard through the grapevine what the story is. He took the position as king. And the first thing he did, as soon as he was on the throne, is he started doing offshore investments. And when the end of the year came, he had something to take with him. So the Chovos HaLevavos says that's the difference between people who live their lives trying to amass wealth versus people who live their lives investing in their neshama. That's the difference. Okay, so it's a great parable, right? So that's related to exactly what we're learning here. But he doesn't stop there, because like I said, he's giving a whole shir, and then he continues and he says, "V'chein kosu b'Tehillim al yedei David melech Yisrael." The same is written in Tehillim by the hand of David, king of Israel. As if we did not know who wrote Tehillim, right? He has to tell us that it's Tehillim, and it has to tell us it's the Tehillim of David, and he has to remind us that David is the king of Israel. Okay, why is all that information relevant at this particular point? What does it say in Tehillim? That in Tehillim 119, David HaMelech says, "It is better for me to have your Torah, the Torah of your mouth, than all the thousands of pieces of gold and silver." And he concludes with a pasuk from the prophet Haggai that says, "Li azav li hakesef ne'um Hashem Elokim," that Hashem says, all gold and silver is mine. Okay, this poor guy was trying to find a rabbi for his community. And this is what he gets. He gets a whole drosha from a dizzy height saying, you don't understand anything, and whatever you've offered me is valueless. What's going on up here? Right? We need to understand the nature of the story. We don't know, but we'll see. And we'll see he is asking him to come live over there, so there must be a motivation why he wants him to come live there. So now, depending on whose opinions you look at, the nature of, or the identity of this person that he meets on the road is very interesting. Because, for example, the Medrash Shmuel says that this was Eliyahu Hanavi. And so this was a test. It's a test. Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma is being offered this lucrative lifestyle to see whether or not he'd remain as dedicated as he should to his Torah learning. However, a number of the other Mefarshim, including the Maharal, the Lechem Shamayim, etc., they say that this was the Satan. This was the Satan. And the Satan got into his head, Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma's head, trying to schlep him into a place that would not necessarily be a place of Torah focus. And their justification for saying this is, there's something about the story that does sound a little bit like unnecessary information. Pa'am achas ayusi mahalech badarach. I was once walking on the road. Really? Your whole life you only once walked on the road? What does that mean? Now the emphasis of the story makes it sound like this was the one time that I was out there walking. Now what is consensus across all of the commentaries on this Mishnah is that Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma was somebody who was so dedicated to Torah learning that he didn't do things for leisure. Whatever he did was very focused and very specific. In fact, when I told you the story at the beginning, that he went to ransom these kids who had been taken by the Roman, there's even a possibility that this is the reason he's on the road. He's not on the road stum. He's on the road because there's a pressing mitzvah that has to be done that nobody else can do. And so therefore he has to travel and take care of it himself. So why is Rabbi Yossi telling the story in this particular fashion? Because he wants you to know that under ordinary circumstances he would not have left his community, would not have left the place of Torah learning. But sometimes there's a mitzvah that nobody else can do, and you have to step up to the plate, and you have to be willing to expose yourself, and that's what happened to him. Now that he exposed himself, as we well know, there's the expression, we know it from the story of Moshe Rabbeinu, why he didn't want to give his son a bris while he was on the way back to Mitzrayim, because Satan mekatrek baderech, because the Satan uses the fact that a person is exposed when they're traveling as an opportunity to try and somehow harm the person. Now, we always think of harm as something physical. The reality is the Satan is far more interested in spiritual harm. Let's remind ourselves, the Jewish view of Satan is completely different to the conventional view. We do not see the Satan as some independent operator who has power, who could challenge Hashem. Satan is on Hashem's staff. Satan is a malach with a particular job description. And the job description of the Satan is to find ways to challenge us, so hopefully we can overcome the Satan and therefore become more dedicated in our Yiddishkeit. But the goal of the Satan is not to trip us up, it's to create an environment through which we become stronger. So here we've got somebody who's reached a point in his service of Hashem that he's completely dedicated, he's studying Torah at the highest level, and now that he's stepped out to engage in a different modality, a different service of Hashem, now the Satan comes in and says, well, maybe this is where you need to go with your life. Who says that the way that you've done things up until this point in time, which is to be completely invested in Torah learning, is in fact where you should go. Not everybody has to be a scholar all of the time. And so here is an alternative. Let's try a different proposition. Maybe there's another way that you could serve Hashem. What's that way? That's why he says poga, right? Poga means that he's being assaulted. That's exactly why that word is used, because the implication is that if Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma does not manage this process properly, it could actually harm him. Like any time that we engage with our Yetzer Hara, otherwise known as the Satan, that's what happens. It's a pigua. It's an attack. And then, of course, there's the possibility that we defend against the attack and we therefore emerge stronger on the other side. But the fact is that in the moment, it's pogabi. Exactly. That's why he says that this man didn't just encounter me, but it was almost like an abrasive encounter. That would possibly explain why Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma doesn't greet him. Because he doesn't want to engage. He understands what's coming. He's a highly perceptive individual. He's a great Torah scholar. He sees exactly what's headed his way. And so his natural response is, block it off. I'll tell you a beautiful story. There was an individual who once came to the Maggid of Mezrich, who was the successor to the Baal Shem Tov. And he said, I have a big problem. I don't believe anybody here has this problem. It must have existed only a few hundred years ago. So what's the problem? He says, whenever I try to daven, I get invasive thoughts. Have you ever heard of this? I read about this once in a book. So I get invasive thoughts while I'm trying to daven. He says, how do I control these thoughts? So the Maggid of Mezrich said, I'll be honest, I don't have an answer for you, but I do have a chassid who lives in such and such a town. You need to leave immediately. Go to that chassid and ask him to guide you on how you don't allow invasive thoughts. So he immediately gets on the first wagon, heads out to this town. It takes a few hours to get there. By the time he gets there, it is very late at night. Everybody's asleep. And he's now got to try and find the house of this particular chassid. So he's looking, he has a description of who he's looking for. He's going house to house to house. Eventually gets to a house and he sees that there's light in the house. He looks through the window and sure enough, there's this chassid, as he's been described, sitting, poring over a book late at night, deeply engrossed in Torah learning. It's freezing cold outside. Inside the house, it looks very warm. He starts knocking lightly on the window to try to get his attention. Doesn't get his attention. He starts knocking louder, and then on the door, this, shouting, banging, this, that. Eventually, the guy doesn't look up. He's completely engrossed in his learning. He doesn't look up from his book. And this fellow is freezing cold, so he goes to the shul, because that's the only place you could be guaranteed, a place to stay. He sleeps on a bench in the shul. The next morning, he goes back to this chassid's house, knocks on the door. He says, with your permission, I've been sent by the Maggid of Mezrich, and he asked if you could please teach me, how do you block invasive thoughts? He says, I taught you last night. So that's what's happening over here, right? Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma sees what's coming, so he decides he's not engaging. He's not going to say hello. He's not going to say shalom. That's why, in spite of the fact that generally speaking, you're supposed to first preempt a greeting to somebody else, he understands that this is potentially a trap. It's a pigua. This is an assault on him, and therefore he's not willing to respond. to engage. However, once the person nosan li shalom, once the person greets me, then I don't have a choice. I have to respond. You can't be a disgusting human being. So then he had to respond, and that is what opened up this conversation. That's assuming that it's as dark as that this individual is the Satan. However, quite a number of the commentaries say very simply this was an ordinary person. Yes, maybe the whole story was orchestrated as a test for Rabbi Yosef and Kisma, but it's an ordinary person who is looking for a rabbi for his community. And if you put it into that perspective, it becomes a very interesting story. Because what's happening over here is Rabbi Yosef and Kisma, yes, we did have a Mishnah much earlier on that said, have a makdim b'shloim kol adam, that you're supposed to preempt greeting every person that you see. We also had a Mishnah much earlier on in the 4th chapter, that if a person is traveling, then what should they do? They should study Torah while they're traveling in order to be protected. Not only that, but we said that if a person is how's the expression go? If a person is traveling on the road and then they stop learning for something which is less valuable, that is somebody who takes their own life in their own hands. So now you've got somebody who is Rabbi Yosef and Kisma, we're told, is one of those individuals. There are a few people that the Gemara also describes this way. Loi posik pume megirisa, which means their mouth never stopped saying words of Torah. So when they were sitting in a yeshiva where you could fully engage intellectually, then they would study with the full investment of the intellect. But when they were on the street, even if you were distracted by being on the road, they made sure that they were constantly saying words of Torah. It's actually interesting. There's the very first book that the Lubavitcher Rebbe printed is a book called the Hayom Yom. It's got a thought for every single day. And today's Hayom Yom says that wherever you go, you should always be revising words of Mishnah wherever you go, because that will protect you and it will bring you a lot of bracha, and it will also help to cleanse the environment in which you find yourself. So here he is, Rabbi Yosef and Kisma is traveling on the road. The way he travels on the road is not like us. He's traveling on the road, reviewing Torah as he goes. And therefore, because he's reviewing Torah, it's inappropriate for him to interrupt, even to greet somebody else. That's not appropriate. You're talking to Hashem, and how you're going to stop to greet somebody else, not appropriate. So he doesn't greet the individual who comes towards him. However, once the person greets him, he is required halachically to respond. In fact, we're told in halacha that even if you're saying the Shema, when you're not allowed to greet somebody, if a person greets you and they don't know any better, you have to acknowledge them. In some way, you don't speak, obviously, but you have to acknowledge them. So in the same way, he is not supposed to initiate the conversation because he's in the middle of learning. But once the conversation begins, he's required, he's obligated to respond. So he responds to this individual. So the individual says to him, where are you from? Why does he jump straight to that point? Where are you from? So again, he's just noticed, how many people have you ever encountered where you're walking on the street and they walk past you completely engrossed in Torah learning to the point that they don't even say hello? It's not common. I remember once, years ago, I just got my driver's license and I was driving here on Lubova and stopped at a red light, and I looked over to the left and one of the rabbis from the Joburg Jewish community was in the car next to me, and I looked over and I saw his mouth was moving at the red light. His mouth was just moving, reviewing Torah. I was so impressed by that. As a youngster, I was so impressed by that. That incredible sense of focus. Now we're all lazy. We just listen to podcasts. I'm sorry, but that's also Torah, and it is. Well, some of them are. So, in any event, so he notices that this is somebody who is so engaged in Torah learning, he doesn't have to get into the details of who are you. He realizes this is the type of person that we want to bring back to our community in order to inspire our community. The only thing is, does he really want the community to be inspired? So quite a few of the Meforshim pick up on the fact that he says, I want that you should come tadur imanu bimkolmeinu. You should come live with us in our place. Now that is a loaded statement. Come live with us in our place. So some of the Meforshim say that what he was trying to explain is, you don't have to worry. You are living right now under Roman dominion. You have a lot of tsuros. You have colleagues who are being hunted by the government. Come live with us. It's our place. We don't have these problems. We're not beholden to anybody else. We don't know where the place was, but the implication is that this is a place that is free of that kind of oppression that you're living with in Israel. That's quite lucrative, right? But there is the other side of it, which we'll get to in a moment. So if you go with that view, that he's effectively saying, come live in a safer environment where you don't have to be looking over your shoulder and worrying about edicts against Judaism, then he says, not only that, but I will give you so much wealth that you won't have to worry about an income. Not only will you not have to worry about an income, you will have the opportunity to do this incredible amount of tzedakah. You'll be able to help so many people. So not only will you help us spiritually by being our guide, but you'll help us financially as well. You'll be the one dispersing tzedakah. And generally speaking, we'd prefer to have a tzaddik, a Talmid Chacham, somebody who understands Jewish values and understands Torah values, to being the one dispersing tzedakah, instead of somebody who's just there for the yichus, right? So it sounds like a very attractive deal. To which he responds, even if you gave me all the money in the world. That's what he says. All the gold, all the silver, all the precious stones in the world, which basically means I am the only person who can give tzedakah. Even if you created that reality, that nobody else except for me would be able to give tzedakah. So I'm now doing what our sages call ha-mitzvah, the ultimate mitzvah, right? Tzedakah is considered like the most generic mitzvah, the most all-encompassing mitzvah. You're offering me that opportunity. Still, I'm not going to take it because I'm only willing to live in a place of Torah. So that's if you take the view that this individual was very genuine in his approach. Now, we can identify that he was genuine in his approach because he asked, what place do you come from? And the implication of what place do you come from is showing a little bit of sensitivity. I need to know, are you originally from a place where you are the great rabbi of that place? Because if that's the reality, I can't take you. I can't poach you. You can't build one community at the expense of another community. And that's a principle that should always apply across the board. I'm not going to offer you a position if you come from a place where you are the one holding that place together. So he asks him open-ended question. What kind of a place are you from? Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma says, I come from a place that has many sages, right? Many chachamim, many sofrim. And by the way, Chachamim implies people who have wisdom, and Sofrim implies people who are not only wise, but are empowered, they're entitled by the Torah to write Torah. That's what it means to be a scribe. That's why we use the expression when we speak about the rabbis, we call them Divrei Sofrim. These are the individuals who are entitled by the Torah to write halacha. So he says, I come from a place with many, many scholars. It's only at that point that the guy says, in that case, why don't you come live with us? In other words, he's saying, your community is going to be fine. There are so many sages, there are so many rabbis there. They actually don't need you in order to survive. We, on the other hand, we need you. So if we come from that perspective that this is not the Satan, but rather this is an individual with a genuine concern who's spotted somebody who looks to him like the ideal candidate to become the rabbi of their community, and he's done a quick background check to make sure that he's not going to do so at the expense of the other community, then this is a valid proposal. In which case, the response of Rabbi Yossi is, it might be a valuable proposal for your needs, but it's not the appropriate proposal for who I am. Okay? And that's really going to be his response, but we'll get back to that in a second. Let's first look at the alternative. The alternative is that this individual doesn't have such noble intentions. And that's why he's saying, I want you to come live imanu bimkoimenu. I want you to come live with us in our place. It's almost like saying, Rabbi, we're not going to budge. We need a rabbi because that's what we do. Anybody who's ever dealt with the mainstream, shul communities and their committees, very often that's exactly how it works. We'd like a rabbi who's going to give good droshes on Shabbos and facilitate all the lifestyle, what we call milestone events in our lives. We don't want somebody who's going to tell us how to be Jewish. Yeah, that we prefer not. Bim koimeinu, we want to stay in our place, and in that case, this interaction between this man and Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma might be one of the most timeless stories of Jewish leadership that exists. Right? Come along, be our person, fulfill that role, do all the things we need done. Just don't move us out of our place. Bim koimeinu. Now, if that is the case, if that is what this man was proposing, then Rabbi Yossi's answer doesn't seem to be so clear, because then why is Rabbi Yossi saying, even if you gave me all the money in the world, I would not live elsewhere but a place of Torah? He should have just said, you guys have to know that it's up to you to move. So the fact that he doesn't respond by saying that this is not how Torah works, and you have to be ready to grow through Torah, the fact he doesn't say that is the reason why it's only one of the commentaries, I think, who points out, Bim Koimenu, that it's like kind of on our terms, because it doesn't really seem to be what he was addressing in his response. So it seems much more likely that it was a genuine request.
I also maybe he wasn't in his comfort zone now, but going there might change, might become his comfort zone.
You're saying for Rabbi Yossi.
Yes,
Rabbi Yossi would become,
he would lose some of
possibly, and that would relate back to the word poga, right? That he's going to be harmed by this experience. Right now he's at a certain level of dedication to Hashem, and in that environment perhaps he'd be at a lesser level of dedication to Hashem, and that's valid. Correct. And I think another important thing that we have to remember is that we learned in the first perek, we learned that you have to be a student of Aaron, which is to love people and all of that, but mekarvan la Torah. You have to bring them to the Torah, not the other way around. And according to this particular view, it sounds like a community that wanted to bring the Torah to them. So, we'll pay your salary, don't tell us what to do, kind of concept. Good question. Good question. Good question. I'll tell you a story that once happened. For those people who know Rabbi Levi Weinberg here in Joburg, so he has a brother, Rabbi Yitzchak Weinberg in Vancouver. And there was once, this is many decades ago, so there was once a chassid from another chassidic group who went to his Rebbe to ask for a bracha to move to Vancouver, which at that time was not a very developed Jewish environment. And his Rebbe told him, you can't go. So he said, but what about, there's Weinberg? That's what he said to his Rebbe. He said, but there's Weinberg, there's this Chabadnik, who's in Vancouver. So he said, Weinberg might live in Vancouver, but he's actually in New York. and that's really the message, right? The message is that if a person is going to be out there trying to have an impact on other people, it has to be that you are linked very firmly to where you belong, and that you see yourself like Avraham Avinu, right? Avraham Avinu says that even when I'm living here, I'm still a stranger. With you, I'm a stranger. I don't belong with you, right? Yaakov Avinu comes back and says, "Im Lavan garati." I was a ger, I was a foreigner with Lavan. It's not where I belong. So as long as a person has that clarity that I'm here to fulfill a mission, but it's not where I belong, then you have a chance of fulfilling the mission. But the minute it becomes bim koimenu, this is our place, then we're in a spot of bother, as they say in the... Well, we're Jewish South Africans instead of South African Jews, as an example, right? So where we want to live is not necessarily geographic, it's where we want to live, because unfortunately, we've seen people go from here to Israel, and also hasn't been an upgrade of the Yiddishkeit. Can happen. It's where you want to live, right? Do I want to go there because I want to live in the Holy Land, or do I want to go there to get a tax break? Bit of a difference.
Rabbi, can I just ask, could this not just simply superficially be how we make choices? We choose that we're going to keep Shabbos, we choose that it's more valuable than all the gold and silver. Absolutely.
But here we're talking specifically about Torah. Remember, this is chapter 6. Chapter 6 is Kinyan HaTorah. Yes. This whole theme is specifically about Torah learning. Because remember, here the choices are not between something that is wrong and something that is right. This is a choice between learning Torah or going out and engaging with the community. And that's Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma's final response to him. He says you have to understand, and this is really valuable to know, that one of the most important things in life is to identify correctly what my avoida is. Unfortunately, people spend a lot of time trying to be somebody else. So we look and we see that this individual is doing really well in this particular area of their Yiddishkeit, and we become somewhat envious of them. We say, I'd like to be like them. It looks really amazing. Now, here you've got somebody who has a great opportunity to go into a community, to have an engagement with that community, to influence that community. Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma says that is a valuable way of serving Hashem. It's not my avoida. That's not what I'm supposed to be doing. That's why it says if you would give me, it doesn't say if you gave a person all the gold in the world, rather learn Torah. It says if you gave me all the wealth in the world, I would rather learn Torah, because this is my avoida. I recognize that Hashem's place for me is to be in an environment of absolute Torah learning. And for somebody else, if they were to be in my place, they would not be doing what Hashem wants of them. And that's so important for us to remember, because sometimes we feel a little bit critical of those individuals who spend their whole life learning, why they're not engaging in society. And sometimes they're critical of us, why we're not learning Torah all the time. It's very important to recognize that there are streams. Hashem did not create an homogeneous Judaism. There are streams within Judaism. You have to be able to recognize where your avodah is, and then based on that you can make the correct decision. And we'll conclude with this, and that is one of the teachings of Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma, which is recorded in the Gemara Shabbos. He says this: it's better to stand on 2 legs than to stand on 3 legs. That's what he says. And the Gemara explains what he meant is that it's better to be young than to be older. When you're young, you can stand on your own 2 feet. When you're older, you need a third, you need a stick in order to support you. And what the Gemara then goes on to explain is he's not, God forbid, saying that there's something wrong with being older. What he's saying is that it's better to learn Torah when you have the capacity to learn Torah of your own accord, rather than to learn Torah when you need somebody else to help you learn Torah. So that's why it says better to be on 2 feet, that's you and the Torah, than 3 feet, which is you and the Torah, and somebody who has to hold you through the process. Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma's perspective was that when you invest in learning Torah with your entire being, that's the ultimate way to serve Hashem. When you're invested in learning Torah, that it has to need an audience, you've got to have people who are listening to what you're saying, and maybe they do buy in, maybe they don't buy in. In his view, that was not the ultimate avodah. Again, he's looking from his perspective. It's not a criticism of other people. He has colleagues at the time who are the greatest Torah teachers, going all over the place. But Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma's particular kav, his particular approach to serve Hashem was stand on your own 2 feet, invest in your own Torah learning, because that's where you have to be. Somebody else, they should go off and they should become the rabbi of this town or whatever it is. Now, all of this still has to reflect in the 3 psukim that he has quoted. So we're going to have to explore those 3 psukim and all the meaning behind them, please God, next week.
So, Rabbi, this is where the red